What would you do if you saw a police officer in trouble, one who had shown nothing but hostility toward you? Would you step in and risk your life to help them? In a moment of chaos, a 10-year-old black boy will make an unimaginable choice, saving a racist officer from an ambush, and in doing so, changing everything forever. This twist is one no one saw coming. The heat was unbearable, pressing down on the city streets like a weight. The sun hung high in the sky, its glare reflecting off the cracked pavement. A warm breeze stirred the litter in the gutters, sending plastic bags fluttering against rusted fences. The neighborhood buzzed with life. Shop owners chatting outside their stores, kids laughing as they rode their bikes over uneven sidewalks, distant car horns punctuating the steady hum of the city. But underneath the surface, there was a tension that never fully faded, a quiet unease that lingered in the air like a shadow. Malek moved through the streets with ease, a small bag of snacks clutched in his hand. At just 10 years old, he had already learned how to navigate the neighborhood with sharp awareness. He walked with confidence, his head held high, but his eyes always scanning, always reading the people around him. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival. His mother had taught him to always pay attention, to know when to stay and when to leave. It was a lesson that had kept him safe more than once. His sneakers scuffed against the pavement as he turned a corner, eyes flicking up toward the familiar figure walking a few yards ahead. Officer Martinez. Everyone in the neighborhood knew him. He had been patrolling these streets for years, but he wasn't the kind of cop people felt safe around. His presence carried an edge, his gaze sharp and assessing, always seeming to look for trouble. Malik had seen him stop boys on the street for no reason, questioning them like they had something to prove. He had heard the way the officer spoke to the people in his neighborhood, cold, condescending, like they were all just problems waiting to happen. Most kids knew better than to get too close. Malik wasn't any different. He kept his distance, making sure to walk on the opposite side of the street. But then, something changed. A dark sedan rolled up slowly near the curb, its engine low and rumbling. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see inside. The way it moved, slow, deliberate, sent a shiver of unease through Malik. He had seen cars like that before, the kind that didn't belong to anyone from around here, the kind that meant trouble. The back door cracked open, and two men stepped out. Something about them set off every alarm in Malik's head. Their movements were too smooth, too controlled. One of them adjusted his jacket slightly, and that was when Malik saw it, the glint of metal, just for a second, before it disappeared beneath the fabric. A gun. Malik's heart pounded as his mind raced. He glanced at Officer Martinez, who was still walking, completely unaware. He hadn't seen them yet. He didn't know what was coming. For a split second, Malik considered just walking away. The officer wasn't his problem. He had never done anything to help Malik or anyone else in this neighborhood. Maybe he deserved whatever was about to happen. But deep down, Malik knew better. It didn't matter who Martinez was. It didn't matter what he had done before. Right now, he was just a man about to be attacked. And Malik was the only one who saw it coming. His fingers clenched around the plastic bag in his hand. His breath caught in his throat. He had to make a decision. Malik had spent his entire life in this neighborhood, learning how to navigate its unspoken rules. At just 10 years old, he had already seen things most kids his age never had to think about. He knew which blocks to avoid after dark, which people to steer clear of, and how to move through the streets without attracting attention. His mother had done everything she could to shield him from the dangers around them, but she couldn't change the reality of where they lived. She worked long hours at a diner, scraping together just enough to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. Malik admired her strength, the way she never complained even when exhaustion settled deep into her bones. He wanted to make her proud, to be the kind of son she could look at and know her sacrifices had been worth it. Despite everything, Malik excelled in school. He had a sharp mind and a hunger for knowledge, always finishing his assignments ahead of time, always asking questions beyond what the textbooks covered. His teachers told him he had a bright future, that he could do something great with his life. But no matter how much he studied or how hard he worked, he couldn't escape the way people looked at him. To some, he was just another kid from the projects, another name in a system that expected him to fail. And to Officer Martinez, he was nothing more than a potential problem. Martinez had been patrolling this neighborhood for years, long enough to feel like he knew exactly who lived here, what they were capable of, and what they were worth. In his eyes, most of them weren't worth much. He believed the only way to maintain control was through force, through intimidation. He didn't care about their struggles, their dreams, or their stories. He had already decided who they were before they even had a chance to prove otherwise. Malik had seen it firsthand. He had watched as Martinez stopped his friends on the block, questioning them for no reason, making them empty their pockets, treating them like criminals before they had even done anything wrong. He had seen the way the officer's eyes lingered on him, the way his gaze hardened with suspicion whenever Malik walked by. Once, when Malik was younger, he had made the mistake of speaking up. It was after school, and he had seen Martinez questioning a teenager outside the corner store, accusing him of stealing. Malik knew the boy. He lived in the same building, always polite, always keeping to himself. But Martinez hadn't cared. When Malik had told him the guy hadn't done anything, the officer had turned on him, towering over him, his voice sharp and full of warning. "You think you know everything, huh? Keep running that mouth and see where it gets you." Malik had never forgotten those words. From that moment on, he had learned to stay quiet. He kept his head down, avoided trouble, avoided him. He knew that no matter how well he behaved, no matter how smart he was, Martinez would always see him the same way. And so, Malik made a choice, to stay out of the way, to never give him a reason to notice him. That was why, when he saw Martinez patrolling the block that day, he didn't even think about acknowledging him. He did what he always did, kept walking, kept moving, didn't make eye contact. But now, standing on the sidewalk, watching the dark sedan roll up near the officer, Malik felt something shift. He could have kept walking. He could have ignored it, let whatever was about to happen unfold without getting involved. After all, Martinez wouldn't have helped him if the roles were reversed. But Malik wasn't like him. He couldn't just stand there and do nothing, even if it meant putting himself in danger. Malik had always trusted his instincts. It was something his mother had drilled into him from an early age. In their neighborhood, instincts could mean the difference between safety and danger, between walking away unharmed and making a mistake that could cost you everything. As he moved down the sidewalk, his senses remained sharp. He had already noticed the dark sedan, already picked up on the way the two men inside had been scanning their surroundings. It was the way they moved, too smooth, too purposeful, that sent a warning through his mind. When the car finally stopped near Officer Martinez, Malik knew something was about to happen. Everything unraveled in seconds. The doors of the sedan burst open, and two men stepped out. The first, a tall, muscular figure in a black hoodie, reached into his waistband, and when his hand reappeared, Malik caught the metallic glint of a gun. The second man moved just as fast, positioning himself near the officer's side, ready to strike. Officer Martinez barely had time to react. His hand went to his holster, but the motion was too slow, too unsteady. Before he could even draw his weapon, the man with the gun raised his arm, aiming directly at him. Malik's heart pounded. He could have run. He could have turned his back and let it happen. He had every reason to. Martinez had never been kind to him, had never treated him with anything but suspicion. But none of that mattered now. In that moment, instinct took over. Malik launched himself forward without thinking. He sprinted toward the attacker, his feet barely touching the ground. Everything around him blurred. The sounds of the street, the bystanders who had yet to react, the officer's stunned expression. His only focus was stopping what was about to happen. At the last second, he threw himself between the officer and the gunman, using every ounce of his strength to slam into the man's arm. The force of the impact was just enough to throw off his aim. The gun fired, the bullet missing its mark and embedding itself into the brick wall of a nearby building. The sudden interference caught both attackers off guard. The second man hesitated, momentarily thrown by the sight of a child jumping into the middle of a fight he had no business being in. It was the smallest fraction of a second, but it was enough. Martinez snapped out of his daze. With a quick movement, he grabbed his weapon and turned it on the unarmed attacker first, delivering a swift strike to his ribs with the butt of his gun. The man staggered back, groaning in pain. The gunman, still off balance from Malik's tackle, tried to regain control, but the boy wasn't done yet. Malik lunged at him again, this time going for his wrist. His hands weren't strong enough to rip the gun away completely, but his sudden grip caused the man to fumble, loosening his hold on the weapon. Martinez seized the opportunity. He lunged, knocking the gun free from the attacker's grip and kicking it out of reach. The second man, seeing that the fight had turned against them, shouted something to his partner. Without wasting another second, the two assailants made the only choice they had left. They ran. Their footsteps pounded against the pavement as they bolted toward the alleyway, disappearing into the maze of back streets before Martinez could pursue them. The moment stretched into silence, broken only by the sound of the officer's ragged breathing. Malik stood frozen, his own breath heavy, his hands still clenched into fists. His heart was racing so fast he could hear it in his ears. The weight of what had just happened settled in his chest like a stone. He had saved him. Officer Martinez, still gripping his gun, turned his gaze toward the boy. There was something in his expression that Malik had never seen before. Shock, disbelief, maybe even something close to respect. Neither of them spoke at first. There was too much hanging between them, too much history, too many unspoken words. But Malik didn't need recognition. He hadn't done it for a thank you. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. In that moment, Malik didn't hesitate to act. A child who had every reason to walk away chose to save the very person who had shown him nothing but disrespect. What would you do if you were in Malik's shoes? Where are you watching from, and what time is it, as you witness this incredible act of bravery? Let us know in the comments below. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Officer Martinez stood frozen, his breath still uneven from the struggle. His hand instinctively hovered near his holster, but the danger had passed. The gunmen were gone. he was alive. And the reason he was still standing there wasn't because of his own training or instincts. It was because of the 10-year-old boy in front of him. Malik stood just a few feet away, his small frame still tense, his fists slowly unclenching. His breathing was ragged, his chest rising and falling as he fought to steady himself. The reality of what had just happened was beginning to settle in. He had acted without thinking, driven only by instinct and the need to do what was right. But now that the dust had settled, he wasn't sure how he felt about it. Martinez had never seen the boy like this before. He had seen him plenty of times, walking home from school, hanging around the corner store, always keeping his distance. He had never caused trouble, never given the officer a reason to stop him. But that had never mattered. In Martinez's eyes, the boy had always been just another kid from the neighborhood, another name in a place filled with people he had long since stopped trying to understand. Now, standing here, looking at the boy who had just saved his life, Martinez felt something unfamiliar creeping into his chest. Guilt. For years, he had patrolled these streets with the same assumptions, the same hardened view of the people who lived here. He had thought of them as problems to manage, as threats waiting to happen. And yet, when faced with real danger, it hadn't been one of his fellow officers who had stepped in to save him. It hadn't been someone from his world. It had been Malik, a 10-year-old black boy. Martinez exhaled sharply, his grip on his gun loosening. He studied the boy, taking in the tension still lingering in his stance, the way his hands trembled slightly at his sides. He realized that Malik hadn't saved him because of who he was. He hadn't done it because he was a cop or because he deserved it. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. For the first time in his career, Martinez felt small. Finally, he forced himself to speak. You didn't have to do that." His voice was quieter than usual, lacking the authority it usually carried. "But you did." Malik didn't respond right away. He was still catching his breath, his mind racing. He wasn't looking for gratitude. He hadn't done this for recognition or to change anyone's opinion of him. He had acted purely on instinct, because no matter what Martinez had done or said in the past, he was still a person, and letting someone die when he could stop it was never an option. He looked up at the officer, his dark eyes unreadable. "I know." Martinez let out a slow breath. He didn't know what to say. He had never been in a situation like this before, never been forced to question himself so deeply. But standing here, looking at the boy he had once dismissed without a second thought, he realized something. He had been wrong. All these years, he had thought he knew this place, thought he understood the people who lived here. But he had never really seen them. He had never looked beyond his own prejudices, beyond the assumptions he had built his entire career around. And now, this boy, this child, had just shattered everything he thought he knew. Martinez hesitated. The words felt foreign, uncomfortable, but he pushed through. "Thank you." Malik simply nodded. He didn't smile, didn't offer any words of reassurance. He didn't need to. The moment itself had already changed something. He could see it in the officer's face. And for the first time, Malik allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this moment would mean something bigger than either of them. Officer Martinez had always believed that people didn't change. He had spent years patrolling these streets, convinced that nothing he did would ever truly make a difference. The people here, in his mind, were set in their ways, just as he had been set in his. But after what happened that day, he could no longer hold on to that belief. Something inside him had shifted. For the first time, he saw the community not as a problem to control, but as people, people with struggles, dreams, and stories he had never cared to understand. And at the center of it all was Malik, the boy who had saved his life without hesitation, despite having every reason to walk away. Martinez didn't just leave that moment behind him. He couldn't. It followed him through every shift, through every interaction he had with the people in the neighborhood. The way they looked at him was different now. Some still distrusted him, but others had heard what had happened. They saw the way he had started carrying himself differently, the way he listened now instead of assuming, the way he spoke to people with something closer to respect. He wasn't perfect, and he knew that. Change wasn't something that happened overnight. But he had started making an effort, and that effort mattered. He started attending community meetings, something he had once dismissed as pointless. He had real conversations with the people he used to see only as criminals or threats. He heard their frustrations, their fears, and for the first time, he didn't push them aside. He apologized to the people he had mistreated, not expecting forgiveness, but giving it because it was the right thing to do. And when it came to Malik, Martinez made sure his gratitude went beyond just words. The story of what had happened spread quickly. At first, it was just whispers within the neighborhood, but soon the local media picked it up. A 10-year-old boy saving a police officer from an ambush wasn't something that happened every day, and the more people heard about it, the more they wanted to know about Malik. But Malik wasn't interested in attention. He didn't care about being called a hero. He had acted because it was the right thing to do, not because he wanted recognition. Still, the city saw what he had done, and soon the opportunity he had never imagined presented itself. A local foundation, moved by his courage, offered him something far more valuable than fame. A scholarship to a better school, one that could give him the education and resources he had always dreamed of but never thought possible. When Martinez heard about it, he didn't hesitate. He knew he had a responsibility now, not just as a cop, but as someone who had been given a second chance to do something good. He met with Malik's mother, sat in her small apartment, and promised that he would look after the boy's future, not as an obligation, but because he wanted to. At first, Malik wasn't sure what to make of it. The idea of Martinez, the same officer he had once tried to avoid at all costs, now wanting to mentor him, felt strange. But Malik had always believed that actions spoke louder than words, and the officer was proving, through his efforts, that he truly wanted to change. So, Malik let him in. Martinez became a steady presence in his life, helping him transition into his new school, offering guidance, and making sure he never felt alone in the opportunities ahead. The officer, who had once been a symbol of fear and authority, was now something entirely different. Someone Malik could trust. And Malik's story didn't just change his own life. It began to shift the lives of those around him. He still spent time in his old neighborhood, never forgetting where he came from. He spoke to kids who were struggling, encouraging them to push beyond the expectations placed on them. He told them that they mattered, that their choices mattered, that they had the power to define their own futures. Officer Martinez stood beside him, a quiet reminder that change was possible. Neither of them had expected this outcome. Neither of them had imagined that one moment of bravery would turn into something so much bigger. But it had, because even the smallest acts of courage could spark a transformation. The neighborhood had always carried a weight, an unspoken tension that never truly disappeared. But in the weeks and months following Malik's heroic act, something began to shift. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't perfect, but change had started to take root. People talked about what had happened, about the boy who had saved a man who had once seen him as nothing more than a problem. It wasn't just a story of bravery. It was proof that perspectives could change, that the walls between them weren't as unbreakable as they had once seemed. Officer Martinez had always patrolled these streets with a sense of detachment, treating the people here like outsiders, even though he walked among them daily. Now, for the first time, he felt like he was truly seeing them. He listened to their stories, their frustrations, their fears. He no longer saw them as statistics, but as individuals, as families, as people who deserved to be heard. He worked alongside community leaders, attending meetings he had once dismissed as pointless. He sat down with people he had ignored for years, hearing them out, admitting his mistakes. The conversations weren't always easy. Some people still distrusted him, and he understood why. But he kept showing up, kept proving through his actions that he was no longer the man he used to be. The police force began to take notice. Other officers started questioning their own approach, wondering if they too had been blind to the realities of the people they were meant to serve. Change didn't happen overnight, but it was happening. And all of it had started with one boy's selfless act. As for Malik, his life had transformed in ways he never imagined. The scholarship had opened doors he had never thought possible, placing him in an environment where his intelligence and ambition could thrive. But despite everything, he never forgot where he came from. He walked the same streets, not as the kid who simply tried to stay out of trouble, but as someone who had proven that where you came from did not define who you could become. The younger kids in the neighborhood looked up to him now, seeing in him a future they, too, could strive for. He became an advocate, speaking in schools, reminding others that their actions had the power to shape the world around them. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Malik walked past the corner store where everything had changed. The sounds of the neighborhood filled the air, the chatter of people outside their stoops, the distant hum of music playing from open windows. He carried himself differently now, not with fear, but with confidence. From across the street, Officer Martinez stood near his patrol car, watching. There was no tension between them anymore, no wariness in their eyes. The past had been rewritten, and though their journey had begun with fear and misunderstanding, it had led to something neither of them had expected. Martinez gave Malik a small nod, one of respect, of gratitude. Malik nodded back, then kept walking, his head held high. Sometimes, the smallest person in the room can make the biggest difference, and sometimes the right moment can change the course of a life.